You're listening to the Shout Podcast, the official health and well-being podcast from the Firefighters Charity.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Shout Podcast. For those of you new to this podcast, my name's Kim Robson and I'm your host. Like so many of you listening, I'm also a beneficiary of the charity, and I know a fair bit about the fire service as my partner John happens to be a firefighter. So it's a pleasure to be able to introduce you to each episode and tell you a bit more about what we've got coming up in this, the official health and wellbeing podcast from the Firefighters Charity. This week's an important one for the charity as it launches a new urgent appeal to help support its fundraising after the coronavirus pandemic cancelled its entire fundraising calendar. So, a little later on, I'll tell you more about why it's so important that we all come together and how you can get involved in helping the Firefighters Charity to claw back some of the £200,000 a month that it would normally make over the summer. This episode of Shout Podcast is also a little different as we dedicate it to an interview with the inspirational Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, Chief Fire Officer at West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service. We talked to Sabrina about how the impact of an emotionally charged, life-changing event in her career led her to complete a 7-year PhD in behavioural neuroscience in just 3 years. How that has led to fundamental change in firefighting best practice across the UK, and why she believes so strongly in promoting positive mental health across the entire fire community. Author of The Heat of the Moment, A Firefighter's Stories of Life and Death Decisions, Sabrina also talks about her inspiration for writing what is a unique insight into the psychological impact of decision-making on the fireground. She's also very kindly given us a signed copy of her book to give away, and at the end of the interview, I'll tell you how you can be in with a chance of winning it. Later on, we'll round up some of your amazing achievements in our regular Thank You To segment. And don't forget, you can get involved in Shout Podcast by sharing your stories, telling us what you want to know, and sharing your good news. Just go to firefighters.org.uk/Shout Podcast. So here we go with episode 3, and to Tim Bainan, who caught up with Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton earlier this week.
Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, Chief Fire Officer for West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, Doctor of Behavioural Neuroscience and author of The Heat of the Moment, A Firefighter's Stories of Life and Death Decisions. Welcome to Shout Podcast. We're delighted to have you. We've got plenty to talk about, but to start with, perhaps you could give us a whistle-stop roundup of what has brought you to the position of CFO at West Sussex today.
Yeah, sure. So I started my career when I was 18 years old, and I actually started as a retained firefighter down in South Wales. Moved around the country a little bit, spent some time in London as well, before becoming a chief in September. But on top of that, actually, I also I'm an honorary research fellow at Cardiff University, and I do research with a small research group there, looking at risk critical decision making with the aim of trying to make firefighters and also the public safer by reducing human error.
I think you've been quite modest there in your summary of your career today. I know you've done an awful lot, climbing up the ranks and spending time as Deputy Assistant Commissioner at London Fire Brigade, and as you say, moving on to Surrey, and then to the position of Chief Fire Officer at West Sussex. You've done an awful lot there in the fire service alone, but you've managed to squeeze in a PhD as well. How on earth have you managed to do that?
I don't like wasted time. I like to fill my time, I think it would be fair to say. I think for me the point about the PhD and the research is it was always done with the idea of trying to make things better in mind. And it was actually born out of an incident that I went to that completely changed my world. So I was a firefighter at the same time that my husband, to be at the time, was a firefighter, and we were on neighbouring stations. And one day I was called to respond to an incident where a firefighter had been very severely burned. And I can remember being called out to this, and the bells went down, and I went down into the appliance bay, and there were a couple of guys who were already at the teleprinter. And I could tell that something was wrong just by the look on their faces. And they were kind of telling me what it was as I was pulling on my boots and yanking the braces up over my shoulders. And as I went to get on the truck, I kind of looked at them and I was like, well, come on then, let's go. And they said, yeah, it's Mike's truck, Sab. It could be Mike. And it was at that point that the gravity of the situation hit me. And I felt just completely torn, because at that moment I was torn between the role of a responder and all of the responsibility and the accountability that goes with that, and the role of a loved one and all of the fears and anxieties that ordinarily would go with that. And in our job, every single day, we see normal people who woke up to a normal day, having their cornflakes, expecting just routine to happen. But something happens and it completely rocks their worlds. And by the time we turn up, they've moved from that place of, actually, I just expected to have a normal day, to sometimes it being the worst day they've ever had. And in that moment, I thought that was going to be us. I really did. It was quite easily the longest 4.5 minutes of my life travelling to that incident. And when we got there, I jumped off the truck and started to make my way over to the crowd. And there was a huddle of firefighters gathered around someone, and I couldn't see who it was. All I could see was a pair of boots sticking out with kind of dirty patches on the knees, and I had no idea who it was. And at that point, I could feel my heart nearly popping out my chest. I was so frightened. And then I saw Mike stand up. I could see it wasn't him. And in that moment, I felt my legs literally turned to jelly, and I bit down on my lips so hard to stop myself from crying that I've still got a scar inside my lip to this very day. And somehow I joined my crew and we dealt with the scene. And I can remember thinking to myself, just keep it together, just don't become a hindrance. But it wasn't until after that shout that, the reality of what happened had really hit me. What had happened is I was kind of replaying this scenario and thinking it over. And first you'd have that wave of terror because you'd kind of imagine quite graphically what an alternative outcome could have been. And I was there, I was at the scene, I knew exactly what everything looked like. So your brain would visualize it in quite a vivid way. And then I'd have this massive sense of relief because I knew that it hadn't happened. But then I was hit with this wave of guilt because I felt like by not wanting it to be Mike so badly, I felt like I'd wished it on someone else. And this someone else wasn't just a colleague, he was our friend, And so I found it really difficult to deal with. And at the time, I didn't say anything to anyone because in truth, I was afraid that people think I couldn't cope or that I was weak. And if I'm being really honest with you, I was a little bit afraid at the time that some of the cynics might suggest my weakness was predisposed because I was a woman. So I didn't say anything. And I know now that was the wrong thing to do. But at the time, I was just looking for a way to cope with it, to make it constructive. And so then I started to look at how we could stop something like that happening again. And initially I thought, quite naively in retrospect, I thought maybe if we could get a better burns pack, we'd be better prepared next time. So I started to look at things, and the more research I did, the more I found that shocked me. And I found that actually 80% of the time when people are injured across all industries, not just fire, but 80% of the time, it's down to human error. So it's not a problem with a piece of equipment or a flawed policy or a procedure, but a human mistake. And in our line of work, that means people can get hurt. So then I kind of figured, well, actually, if we want to reduce human error, we need to be able to understand human error better. And there hadn't been a great deal done in fire. So it was at that point I thought, well, actually, if I'm going to make a difference in this, that's where I need to focus my attention. But I left home at 15, left school at 16. I didn't have any meaningful qualifications that I could use to make a contribution in this area. So I thought, well, I'll just start at the bottom. I'll start again. So I did a degree, first of all, with the Open University and worked through that all the way to a PhD. After the PhD, we convened a very small research group, and I started to do work at the same time that we were doing the National Operational Guidance Programme, looking at how commanders were actually making decisions on the fire ground. And what we found was really incredible, actually. All of our processes were geared up on the assumption that we were using a very kind of analytical process to make a decision. And the reality was we were making very quick, intuitive gut decisions. So then we knew that if we wanted to safeguard people when they were making those very rapid, quick decisions, and they happen in different parts of the brain, by the way, you can't change the way that you'll make a decision, but you have got an opportunity to intervene once the decision's been made and before you action it. And that's where we started to develop some techniques called decision controls, which were explicitly aimed at helping people to make the best decisions that they can and to raise their situational awareness in those very dynamic, very difficult circumstances. So after that, we managed to change the national operational guidance and included them in that. And the techniques that we use are now included in JESUP, in the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Protocol. And we've shared them much broader than the emergency services. We've shared them at a global level, and there's been a huge amount of interest from industry, from businesses, and from other public sector organisations as well. So it's been a phenomenal thing to go from an incident like that was potentially so disastrous and so damaging. From a long-term perspective, it was so damaging. But to go from there to be able to do something that we know is helping people and we know is making people safer, that meant that all of those hours jammed in when when other people were kicking off their boots and watching telly, it was worth it. And I'd do it all again tomorrow.
That's amazing to hear how a single event like that, clearly one that was very traumatic personally for you and one which caused a lot of mixed emotions, which are completely understandable in that situation. But ultimately it's brought about change, it's brought about something good at the end of it. So looking back on it, what are your emotions? How do you look back on that event and how that's shaped things for you?
You can never control what happens in life. You never can. You can't even control how you're going to feel about it. But one thing that you can control is what you do about it, how you respond, whether it's in the moment or whether it's afterwards. And I think for me, I really wanted to do something that could make a difference, because for me, that emotion was so intense. It was so horrible that I didn't want anyone else to go through it. And when we see statistics on people who get injured during the course of their duty, they're not just numbers. Those are real people. They're people who've got loved ones. They're people who've got friends. And that's not to mention all of the people who would have been involved in that incident as well, and who carry both the memories and the guilt in the same way that I did. And the thing is about guilt is it's completely irrational. It's not necessarily based on anything that you could have controlled. But for me, it was almost that relief that it wasn't Mike that made me feel so guilty, because I felt like I was wishing it on someone else's loved one, because someone else would have had all of the emotions that I was worried that I was going to feel when I was on that truck driving there.
I think that's something we see increasingly a lot at the charity. Firefighters having done everything by the book, followed all their training, but it's only afterwards that we see that they are hit by the emotion of what they've experienced or the things that they've seen in ways that they probably couldn't possibly have trained for. How big an issue is that for the fire service today? And what do you think can be done to support people with those unexpected feelings that they might experience or that may come about as a result of the things that they come across in their everyday work?
I think that's a really good question. And I think very often, certainly in my experience, it's that some of the worst feelings and certainly the most emotional issues for me has been thinking about the survivors, thinking about those left behind and how they'll cope with the loss that I personally found the most difficult. And I think, this is inherent with the way that we see ourselves. Being a firefighter becomes such a huge part of your identity that being able to kind of dissociate yourself as a person from being a firefighter is tough. And the thing is about that part of your identity, you see yourself as a protector. You know that people rely on you to go in and to protect them. And, if we can't fix a problem, then we can at least try our best to stop it from getting any worse. So I think when you go into a situation and despite doing everything you possibly can, you're still not able to improve that outcome, that can have a really hard impact on our sense of who we are and how we see ourselves. And I think it's something that can happen incredibly commonly, and something that we should be very mindful of. And one of the things that I've been very passionate about communicating through the work that we've done around decision making is helping people to know that sometimes you're going to have to make a decision that's not necessarily going to come with a good outcome, but it might be the least worst option that you've got. And helping people to think that through at the training stage to help to build resilience before we move on to the fireground is something that for me is so incredibly important. So I think there's more that we can do around the way that we train. I think there's more that we can do with science as well to help to build resilience before we get to the incident ground. And in fact, there's a piece of research that we're doing at the moment that's looking at stress and uncertainty, both of which are very common to us when we're dealing with our operations, but we're looking at how stress and uncertainty can impact on your decision making, because if we understand that more, we can build in techniques to both prepare people to be more resilient and to help people to deal with those circumstances when you are there in the heat of that moment. And so I think that there's more that we can do, but there's more that we've got to learn around that as well.
And what about you? When you look back on your career and some of the incidents that you've attended, are you haunted at all by any of the things that you've seen and that you've come across?
And funnily enough, I wrote about an experience that I had in this sense, and that there'd been a road traffic collision that I'd been to, and it was a young couple. They just got married, and they were just on their way back from their honeymoon, actually. And they'd had quite a bad road traffic collision, and the man had been killed instantly, and the woman was still conscious when we arrived. And, you know, the thing that kept hitting me was that this woman's kind of last experience of the person that she loved so dearly and had just married and had planned to spend the rest of her life with was actually quite a graphic view of him not of his final moments, and I just kept thinking to myself, I don't know how I would, how that's just so unfair. And when I was thinking about this afterwards and reflecting on it, what I realised is the reason that affected me so much. And I went quite quiet for a couple of weeks, and I would kind of think about it all the time, and it took me a while to process it. But I kept. The point for me is that they were at a really similar life place to where I was. I was just about to get married at the time as well. And it shifted my worldview of what forever meant, because it gave me quite a kind of a concrete example of how forever didn't actually end up lasting forever. So at the time, it wasn't necessarily that I was processing and was it wasn't necessarily what I'd seen that was so difficult for me. It was realigning my worldview of what that concept meant, because it was so meaningful to me at that particular point in time. And I think that's why sometimes when we go to particular incidents, we might be surprised at the ones that do bother us the most, because there's something there, there's some commonality that we can relate to in some aspect of our lives.
And of course, June 23rd is Public Service Day. How important do you think it is for us all, for the general public as a whole, to take a little bit of time just to stop and reflect on the work of the fire services and the work that our firefighters and our control and support room staff, the work that they all do, not just to think about their day-to-day roles, fighting fires and helping us all, but also about the fact that they are human beings like the rest of us too.
Having a day to pause and reflect can be really helpful in just realigning perspectives. And I think the thing for me about the fire service is there's such a strong stereotype. People assume that we will swing in like superheroes and make everything better. And they see us sometimes, it's so easy to see us as kind of automatons in a uniform. And the reality is we're not. We're human beings with the same fears and flaws and fallibilities as anybody else. And firefighters and all emergency service responders put themselves in a position where they're the ones that are the last line of defence. So we're the ones that come and help when no one else in that situation knows what to do. And we see things that will carry with us forever. And we have to make decisions that we know will stay with us forever as well. And that's our everyday office for us. That's a real thing. And while we go into that with our eyes open and we know what we sign up for when we join an emergency service, actually the reality is it has a huge impact on who you are and how you live your life. So I think it is important actually that we all pause and we reflect on how fortunate we are that we have people who are so selfless that they will put themselves into those roles and into those positions to make sure that they're there for people when they need them.
How important is the Firefighters Charity in supporting you and your teams?
Oh, you're absolutely essential. You really are. I think that the work that you do to provide that additional care for firefighters and their beneficiaries is just second to none. It's absolutely wonderful. And every firefighter that I've spoken to who has benefited from using your facilities has spoken so highly of it. The impact that it's had on their lives has been significant, and consequently the impact it's had on their families' lives has been significant. It's really eased some pains for people, and we're grateful for it.
I'm delighted that's the case. Obviously, that's what we're here to do, so it's good to hear. How important as well do you feel it is for firefighters and fire rescue service personnel as a whole to support the Firefighters Charity?
I think it's crucial, and I know that firefighters take huge pride in raising money for the charity, and it's something that we'll continue to do in services and support in any way that we can.
You've also very kindly given us a signed copy of your book, The Heat of the Moment, which we're going to give away on our social media platforms to our listeners. And I just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about it, some of the inspiration behind it, what it's about, and how it's going for you.
I wrote the book really because I wanted to take everything that we'd learned from nearly 2 decades of firefighting and a decade of research and apply it to all walks of life, because I believe very firmly that there's a lot that we can share with people from what we do in the fire and rescue service. So the idea was to really show people how their brains are working when they're making those very instant heat of the moment decisions. So each chapter opens with an incident, and you'll look at a particular aspect of decision making in situ, and then the second part of the chapter then goes on to unpick that using research and broader research, and then applies it to how you might be making a decision in a similar way in everyday life. So the other part of what we wanted to do with it is to help people to see the human side of firefighters more as well, and maybe challenge what people think about when they think about a firefighter. And it was funny, when I wrote it, I thought it might appeal to quite a niche audience, but the interest that we've had from people from all walks of life really has been incredible. And one of the things that I did in the book was quite scary for me, and I started to talk about my previous experience of homelessness, which happened when I was a teenager. And I found it really difficult because it's something that I wanted desperately for nobody to ever find out about. But I know that the reality is that there are still thousands of people who are in the same space today as I was back then. And I wanted them to know that your circumstances don't define you, and they don't determine where you end up, only where you start from. So although it was really difficult to stand up as a fire service leader who's meant to be completely infallible and say, hey, I'm vulnerable, this happened, was really hard, but it was so worth it. I've had so many messages from people who are doing okay now, but who've also experienced homelessness. And by talking about it, it's starting to break down the stigma. And it's been really wonderful and heartfelt to hear some messages from people who've said that they too have experienced homelessness and have kept it to themselves because of the stigma, because they're worried about what people will think about them. But it's helped them to start to open up a conversation. So whilst personally difficult for me, I think it was really important to do.
My final question would be on that subject of personal adversity. You mentioned it there and you talk about it bravely in your book about your time being homeless. What would your message be to anyone listening to this, any member of your fire rescue service or any fire rescue service who's facing their own personal adversity, whatever that might be in whatever form that might be in? What would your message be to them?
I think my message would be that you are much stronger than you perhaps think you are, and to take it step by step, because if you think about how far you've got to go and how far the journey is, then it's easy to freeze, but no one ever gets scared of a single step. So focus on the small steps and they'll build into something great.
Sabrina, that's it. Thank you very much for joining us on Shout Podcast. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much for all the information you've given us and all that you've shared. And we wish you well.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
There was a line in that interview with Sabrina where she talked about firefighters being the ones to make someone's worst day better. And I think that goes to show just how important the Firefighters Charity is to supporting those who do just that. It was a pleasure to welcome her onto Shout Podcast. And if you haven't already read Heat of the Moment, maybe you should give it a try. In fact, you can win a copy of Sabrina's book by simply leaving Shout Podcast a review on iTunes and by sharing our special Facebook, Twitter and Instagram posts. Just look out for the post with the cover image of The Heat of the Moment and hit the share button. You'll find them on the Firefighters Charity's usual social pages. We'll pick a winner at random on the 8th of July. Now, it's always good to say thank you. So here we go with another 2 minutes of rapid fire gratitude for all those fundraisers and fire and rescue services who have gone over and above the call of duty over the last fortnight. Thanks to Martin Lone and Hazel Waddingham Lewis, who completed their Team Snowdon Fire Family Challenge, raising a combined £85. Jean Biles completed a mini triathlon at home, raising a cracking £190. And Dave Shaw and Shona Mellon's children Oliver and Isla completed their 2.6 challenge, raising a fantastic £255. Paul Reed took on the 999 Golf Shot Challenge, raising £409, while Darcy the Pomeranian made an incredible doggy dash for 2.6 kilometres in a firefighter's fancy dress outfit, raising £140. Greenwatch at Guildford Fire Station raised £745 by running 100k on a treadmill outside the station on one 12-hour shift. Dave Smith made the most of the sunshine and completed his gardening challenge, raising £90. And Darren Goff finished a St Florian Drill Yard half marathon, raising £640. A brave Dave Hunt shaved off half his beard and half his hair to raise an incredible £1,725. And firefighters at Porchester Fire Station carried out a 5k treadmill run in full kit to raise £1,628. Wilmslow Fire Station in Cheshire asked its Twitter followers to count how many times they could spot Blaze Bear in their videos. Well done, Charlie, aged 3, who was the winner. Congratulations to the winners and runners-up of the 2020 Women in the Fire Service UK Awards for your outstanding achievements and contributions to the fire and rescue services. Meanwhile, crews at Murfield Fire Station in West Yorkshire helped to support the local Murfield in Bloom Festival by filling up water containers across the station platforms. And Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has been reaching out to the most vulnerable people in their communities, with Bishopbriggs employee Lynn Sweeney befriending isolated pensioner Georgina through regular phone calls. It's the beginning of a true friendship, and the pair are looking forward to meeting in person. Finally, firefighters in Glasgow faced an unusual rescue effort after a fox cub got his head stuck in an old wheel recently. The crew used specialist cutting equipment normally used in road traffic collisions to free the clumsy cub. Some very worthy fundraisers and firefighters there. Thank you to them all. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, the Firefighters Charity is this week launching an urgent appeal to help it through the coronavirus pandemic period. Like so many other charities, the Firefighters Charity has had to cancel all its usual face-to-face fundraising events and won't be bringing in the income it would usually bank on from mass participation events such as fire station open days, marathons and cycling events. At this time of year, that would normally equate to around £200,000 a month. So losing such significant fundraising opportunities has hit the charity hard. However, the need for the charity doesn't stop, and today it continues to do everything it possibly can to support the physical, mental and social well-being of the entire UK fire services community. So the charity has launched an urgent appeal to help it through this difficult time, and it's asking you to donate today. Whether you're a frontline firefighter, working support or control, whether you're married to a firefighter, related to one, or simply someone who respects and admires the work of our fire services, the charity is asking you to set up a regular donation to support it. Doing so is the only way we can guarantee the long-term future of the Firefighters Charity through this pandemic and beyond. So please, donate today. It's really easy to do so online at firefighters.charity.org.uk/appeal. Thank you. That's it for episode 3. Thanks for listening. Please tell your friends and colleagues to listen, subscribe and review. And don't forget, you'll be in with a chance of winning a copy of Sabrina Cohen-Hatton's book, The Heat of the Moment, by doing so this week. All of the information you need is on the website at firefighters.charity.org.uk/shout podcast and on the Firefighters Charity's social media channels. We'll have much more for you in the next episode in a fortnight's time. Until then, take care and stay safe.
You've been listening to the Shouts podcast. For more information on the show and how the Firefighters Charity could support you, check out www.firefighters.charity.org.uk.